gives me great pleasure today to introduce to you Jay Ford. Dr. Ford is from the Department of Religion. I'm Sharon Snow for a few of you in here who don't know me, and I'm the head of special collections, but I also have the privilege and honor to serve as the religious studies liaison to the Department of Religion. So I've gotten to know Jay over the years, and I think that you'll have a very good lecture. Just to give you a little background on Jay, he's a Z. Smith Reynolds Fellow in the Department of Religion. He teaches courses relating to East Asian religions. He holds a master's degree in theological studies from Vanderbilt Divinity School and the MA and PhD in East Asian religions from Princeton. He's traveled extensively, and he has lived in Japan for several years. His recent book, Yogic and Buddhist Devotion in Early Medieval Japan, was published by Oxford Press in 2006. It studies a 12th century Japanese Buddhist monk and his impact on the most significant period in the history of Japanese Buddhism. In addition to Jay's research on Japanese and Chinese religions, he also has an interest in inter-religious dialogue through his membership in the Society of Buddhist Christian Studies. He's working on projects related to medieval Japanese Buddhism, and he's currently working on a new book that explores the ways different cultures and religions conceptualize and symbolize the divine source or ultimate reality, and the religious, social, and political implications of those conceptualizations. Today, Jay's topic is Buddhism and the challenges of religious pluralism, reflections on the doctrine of skillful means. So let's give Jay a warm round of applause.
I apologize for sitting down. I had surgery a month ago and then had to go back. I didn't expect to be on crutches now, but I had to go back last week for something else. So if I stand for any period of time, I can feel my toes turning blue. So anyway, I apologize, but this is the best I can do for now. When Sharon asked me to think of a topic, lecture topic, last, I think, early September, as she noted, my research focuses primarily on medieval Japanese Buddhism, a fairly esoteric topic for most of you, I'm sure. So I thought what I would do is try to pick something that may have some relationship to issues today, and yet that sort of brings you into the Buddhist worldview to some extent. And so my topic today comes out of some of my own research in the field of interreligious dialogue between Buddhists and Christians. Reflections on the doctrine of skillful means. And let me just sort of set the context. This is what I wrote as a description for the sort of problematic, if you will, of this lecture. One of the greatest challenges facing all religious traditions in our increasingly globalized world is the undeniable fact of religious pluralism, the reality and growing awareness of other traditions that offer competing, sometimes contradictory claims about ultimate reality, death, the nature of the human condition, salvation, and so forth. And so that is sort of the context, where we live in a time in which this is not something new, religious diversity, but it is something that is no longer can be sort of avoided. Perhaps even up to 25 years ago in America, it was quite possible not to have to confront this issue if you belong to one tradition or another. But today, with the media, with the increasingly globalized world, with the reality of ethnic and religious diversity in our own country, it's impossible to avoid. We encounter this, people of other religious faiths and practices, every day in our lives. And so it has become a more prominent sort of problematic for devotees to particular religious traditions, particularly those that are traditionally Western religions. So today I just want to sort of frame that problematic and go back to a particular teaching in Buddhism that I think may be relevant to this issue. It may be one way for those of us who belong to Western religious traditions or who are familiar with them to think about this problem. A little background, if I could just see a show of hands, don't worry, I'm not going to ask any questions, but how many of you would say you are familiar with the Buddhist tradition, basically? Okay, a fair number. Well, I wasn't going to give an entire, obviously, background to Buddhism, but I will sort of start from the beginning just a bit. As you know, Buddhism is a tradition that was founded in the 5th century before the Common Era by a man we know of as the Buddha. properly pronounced Buddha, that's actually a title. It's much like Messiah or Christ in Christianity. He's also known as Shakyamuni, sage of the Shakya clan. According to the tradition, he was born into a princely family, the Shakya clan, that ruled what is today parts of southern Nepal. At the age of 29, he renounced his princely life and pursued an extreme ascetic path that was not uncommon for the spiritual paths available in India at that time. And after studying under various teachers and trying different techniques, he ultimately had an enlightenment experience when he was 29 years old, or 35 years old, 6 years later. And this enlightenment experience was sort of an insight into the nature of human suffering and a way out, a way somehow to experience life in this world, not in some transcendent realm, in this world that is not characterized by suffering or the existential angst that most of us experience all the time from a Buddhist perspective. And this was known as nirvana. After he realized nirvana, he continued to teach until the ripe old age of 80 years old, traveling throughout northern India. A monastic community gathered around him along with a lot of lay supporters, so that by the time he died, there was a fairly vibrant following that he had. That community developed for another 500 years, grew considerably, but it was centered around the monastic community itself, monastic groups of monks and nuns, with the support of layfolk. The monks and nuns didn't work. They provided, they depended on food, clothing, shelter for everything to be given to them by the lay community. The ideal in that community was a figure we now know as the arhat, literally someone who is worthy of worship. So an arhat is one who joins the monastic community, pursues this very demanding, diligent monastic path in which you live a very simple life, learn very difficult contemplative practices and so forth, and eventually realize nirvana. So an arhat is one who realizes nirvana and upon death enters what is known as parinirvana, final nirvana. Beyond that, it's difficult to describe what parinirvana is after death, but it is an escape from what in the Indian religious context was known as samsara, an endless cycle of birth and death with no beginning and no end, through a multitude of different sentient life forms. But once one enters, realizes parinirvana at the end of one's life, you escape from samsara. Now where that is somewhat of a difficult problem for Buddhism, but at any rate. So that's the early tradition with this arhat ideal that I want to set up. Around the 1st century of the Common Era, roughly half a millennium after the death of the Buddha, there emerges what is clearly a great reformation within Buddhism. And a new form of Buddhism emerges known as Mahayana Buddhism. This is a form of Buddhism that is clearly more lay-friendly. It could be characterized as a more devotional form of Buddhism, and you'll understand why when I start talking about some of the distinctive features of Mahayana Buddhism. There are a number of philosophical developments that emerge within Mahayana, but I'm not going to go there. That would be a whole other lecture. But let me talk a little bit about some of the distinctive features of Mahayana that will inform what I'm really going to focus on, and that is this doctrine of upaya, or skillful means. In contrast to the ideal in the earliest form of Buddhism, the traditional form, the arhat, the ideal in Mahayana Buddhism is a figure known as a bodhisattva, literally one whose being is enlightenment. And a bodhisattva is characterized by the vow they take when one embarks on the Bodhisattva path. That vow reads, "May I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings." May I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. Now, how is that distinct from the arhat ideal in the early tradition? For one thing, the ultimate goal is not nirvana. The ultimate goal is Buddhahood itself. And for the second, The motivation is not to escape samsara and realize whatever pati nirvana is. It is to help other sentient beings. The motivation is an altruistic one. So that as one progresses on the Bodhisattva path with greater insight and wisdom, one has a greater capacity to teach and help other suffering beings. So the motive is one of sort of altruism. Now you can see that this is an implicit, if not explicit, critique of the former tradition. That the ideal in the former tradition was somehow selfish, and that one was, seeking only one's, the arhat was seeking his own escape from samsara, but not really concerned. That's an unfair, probably, characterization, but that's the Mahayana perspective. Indeed, those who followed the Mahayana path called the former tradition Hinayana, literally small vehicle. So Mahayana, the great vehicle, claims to be a vehicle, a teaching, a path that enables everyone to realize Buddhahood and enlightenment. Hinayana, the small vehicle, allows only a few, those who pursue that very difficult monastic path, to realize nirvana. So there's an implicit critique, and that's a fairly pejorative name that they give the former tradition. And we tend not to use that in scholarly circles. The understanding of the Bodhisattva path unfolds as being one in which, through progressive lifetimes, and this is many, 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 many lifetimes, in Buddhist terms, 3 kalpas, which we're talking millions of years, one pursues this Bodhisattva path. And as one pursues this, one perfects, lifetime after lifetime, certain virtues that are important to nurture in order to realize full Buddhahood. Virtues like giving, morality, patience, tolerance, diligence, meditation, wisdom. But the 2 most important virtues for a bodhisattva are wisdom, what is known in Sanskrit as prajna, insight into the nature of reality, into the nature of the self, and compassion. They're like, as the metaphor goes in Buddhism, 2 wings of the bird. They are the 2 things that hold the bodhisattva aloft. So the bodhisattva is understood as being this long journey to Buddhahood that requires a great deal of passion and diligence. Along the way, there are different versions of the stages of a bodhisattva to Buddhahood, but probably the most common is a 10-stage version. And according to that version, along the way, when you get to about the 7th stage, you actually could exit into nirvana and check out. But according to Mahayana, that's really a lower level of realization. And so what a bodhisattva does is intentionally chooses to come back, life after life, even though they have the opportunity to exit at that point, because their motive is to help other suffering beings through teachings and that sort of thing. And the other thing I should note is that as one progresses on this bodhisattva path, you accumulate enormous amounts of good karma. Because you're living in a selfless, sacrificing way, you are always accumulating good karma. So that by the time you get to these 8th, 9th stages of a bodhisattva, you are essentially a god. And in every way, they are very much like Hindu gods in this context. They have supernatural powers. They can manifest themselves in various forms at the same time, same place, in order to help sentient beings. They have the capacity to transfer the merit they've accumulated to other suffering beings. This is something that's unheard of in the early tradition. In the early tradition, the emphasis was on self-effort. The only way you could progress on this path was through your own effort and diligence. You could not depend on any outside power. In the Mahayana tradition, the bodhisattvas emerge as sort of like supernatural beings that lay devotees can devote themselves to and actually gain sort of this worldly benefits through that devotion. So you can understand why Mahayana becomes a more sort of lay-friendly or sort of devotion-friendly form of Buddhism. Another distinctive characteristic are multiple Buddhas that appear within the Mahayana tradition. And the example here I show is Amitabha Buddha. So if you've ever been to East Asia, China, Japan, or Korea, images of Buddha that you see there are probably Amitabha, not the historical Buddha. There's a large Buddha in Kamakura, Japan. This one actually right here. There's another one in southern Japan. There's one in Nara. These are not the historical Buddha, even though most tourists probably think they are. These Buddhas are those, according to sacred accounts, who pursued this Bodhisattva path many, many kalpas ago, realized Buddhahood, and when they did, they acquired the power to, in a sense, create their own realm. And so Amitabha is famous for having created a realm known as the Western Pure Land. And if someone is properly devoted to Amitabha, one can actually be reborn in Amitabha's realm in the next life. And there you're born in the presence of the Buddha, you receive the teachings directly from the Buddha, you accelerate along the path very quickly. So this sounds very different from the early tradition, I know. But again, you can see why it sort of has some devotional or lay appeal to it. Another characteristic of Mahayana Buddhism, and as it unfolds, and by the way, this is a form of Buddhism that takes hold primarily in East Asia. The form of Buddhism today, if you were to go to Sri Lanka, to Burma, Myanmar, Thailand, parts of Southeast Asia, would be that early tradition. It's actually a school known as the Theravada tradition of Buddhism, the only surviving school of that early Buddhist tradition. But if you were to go to China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, what you would encounter is forms of Mahayana Buddhism. And as Buddhism spread to East Asia, it divided into various schools. Some of these you may have heard of. Zen Buddhism is a school of the Mahayana school. You might have heard of Pure Land Buddhism, which is primarily oriented to devotion to Amitabha. There are other schools like the Yogacara school, the Madhyamaka school, the Huayan school, the Tiantai school in China. These are various schools that emerged, focused around very particular sacred texts. Another distinctive feature of Mahayana, as it unfolds, is the incredible diversity and pluralism within Mahayana Buddhism. And let me just talk a little bit about that. There are, as you can imagine now, a diversity of objects of devotion that one might focus on as a lay devotee or even as a monk or nun. So that you have various figures here that are Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We might call these sort of celestial Bodhisattvas, cosmic Buddhas, who live in these realms, who are accessible to us in certain ways. There are a multitude of new sutras that appear that the Mahayana followers claim to be authentic teachings of the Buddha. The sutra is thought to be a discourse of the Buddha, a text that is an actual, someone memorized, heard a lecture given by the Buddha and recites it, and it becomes a sacred text. These texts appear, as you see up on the board, on the screen, are texts that probably appeared somewhere between 500 and 900 years after the death of the Buddha. They were not heard of before that. But those of the Mahayana tradition claim that they are actually authentic teachings of the Buddha. And when you read these texts, what you find is, an incredible diversity of teachings. In many cases, contradictory teachings. Kind of promotion of devotion to a particular Buddha or Bodhisattva, or promotion of a particular practice, not necessarily meditation. So what you find is a diversity of messages in these texts. And so for those who encounter Mahayana Buddhism for the first time, they're like, how does this have any coherence whatsoever? This seems to be contradictory. Not only is it contradicting the early teachings in many ways, but even the teachings within the Mahayana canon are contradictory. Just to point out, I'll come back to a couple of these. The Lotus Sutra in the middle there is probably the most popular sutra in East Asia. Another at the bottom left, the Vimalakirti Sutra, is another popular sutra in East Asia that I'll be citing. But all of these, the Diamond Sutra is central to the Zen tradition. You can see the three Pure Land Sutras central to the Pure Land tradition, and so forth. Eventually, as I noted, a variety of different schools emerge, and a variety of different practices emerge within these schools. Just to give you some idea, there are very difficult, demanding, contemplative, sort of yogic meditation practices that are practiced by the monastic community within Mahayana that continues to survive. There are recitation of sutras, recitation of mantras and dharanis, like abbreviated versions of sutras that somehow encapsulate the whole power and message of a sutra. There are devotion to different supernatural beings, as I've noted, various devotional chants that are associated with each of those beings. There are adherence to different sets of monastic and lay precepts that one might abide by. participation in pilgrimages to sacred site, devotion to relics of the Buddha. All of these kinds of practices make up Mahayana Buddhism. And many of them make up the early tradition as well, so I don't mean to sort of characterize that in such singular terms. Within Mahayana Buddhism, this ideal of the Bodhisattva embodying compassion is actually, those that follow the Mahayana tradition look back to the historical Buddha and they actually see what they sort of value in the life of Shakyamuni himself. So they don't claim that this is a new idea or a new ideal. They actually look back and they interpret the life of Shakyamuni in different ways than the traditional early tradition did. To give you a few examples of this, they trace back to the story of Shakyamuni when he became enlightened. And this is in the early tradition, in the sacred texts of the early tradition. He became enlightened one night after sitting for a long time, realized this great sort of awakening. And the first thing that came to his mind was, there is no way I can communicate this to people. This is beyond words, this is beyond concepts. And so he spent a long time in isolation, deliberating whether he should even open his mouth or not. And one of the famous sayings in this deliberation, he says to himself, enough now with teaching what only with difficulty I reached. This Dhamma, this realization, is not easily realized by those overcome with aversion and passion. What is obscure, subtle, deep, hard to see, going against the flow, those delighting in passion, cloaked in the mass of darkness, won't see. So his initial reaction is, there is no way people are going to get this. But fortunately, this god, Brahma, kind of an Indian god, steps in and says, oh, please, you must go out and teach, and convinces him to do so. And Brahma, as the text tells us, realizes that he himself is dependent on the teachings of Shakyamuni. Brahma realizes himself that he is stuck. This is like the big god in Hinduism, that he is stuck in samsara and he needs Shakyamuni to share this insight. Another example, so my point there is that according to the Mahayana tradition, they look back to Shakyamuni and say, see, he was motivated to actually teach out of compassion for other beings. Other sort of ideas that emerge within that early tradition, according to the Mahayana tradition, they look back and they note that the Buddha was very reluctant to talk about sort of metaphysical truths. He was very sort of skeptical of metaphysical doctrine, dogma, and that sort of thing. And one of the most famous parables along these lines is one known as the poison arrow parable. This is a parable that the Buddha tells, again, in the early traditions, scriptures, that a man is shot by a poison arrow and falls to the ground, and his family is alarmed, and they call the doctor, and the doctor is about to pull out the arrow, and the man goes, no, hold it. I must know, what was the caste of the man who shot this arrow? Of what wood did this arrow come from? What bird did the feather quiver of this arrow come from? You know, he starts asking these irrelevant questions. And the parable, of course, is meant to say, to ask those kinds of metaphysical questions. Does the universe have a beginning? Does it have an end? Is the soul eternal or not eternal? Does the Buddha exist or not exist after he dies? Et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of questions he was reluctant to answer. And basically sort of says, I come to teach only about suffering and the way out of suffering. And so there's this very sort of pragmatic emphasis in the teachings of the early Buddha that play out in this notion of upaya and compassion that I'm going to talk about. And finally, there is another famous parable many of you probably heard of, the parable of the raft, in which a man comes to a river that he has difficulty crossing, and he pulls together various materials that he can, and he builds a raft, and he gets across the river to the other side, and his first thought is, wow, that was a useful tool. I should just carry it around on my back. And the Buddha says, no, don't do that. The Dharma, here, the Dharma is like a raft that gets one to the far shore of Nirvana. The Dharma is for carrying over, not retaining. You monks, by understanding the parable of the raft, should get rid even of right mental objects, all the more of wrong ones. The message here is don't cling even to the teachings that I'm giving you. They are provisional in nature. They are only meant to get you to another point. Don't attach to them as though they are eternal truth. So My point is that there is an emphasis in the early tradition on pragmatic teachings, provisional teachings, and praxis, as opposed to some eternal doctrine. The point, from a Mahayana perspective, and this is true of the early tradition as well, are that the teachings are a means, not an end. This whole notion of emphasis on pragmatism, on the sort of emphasis on praxis, on the provisional nature of teachings, and not the fact that they somehow capture an eternal truth, all in the Mahayana tradition gets interpreted as an example of what they call upaya, or skillful means. A Buddha or a Bodhisattva uses their wisdom, their insight into the nature of reality, into the nature of the problems of life, to discern the best means for communicating that to an audience. So that this notion that wisdom plus compassion, wisdom, insight into the nature of reality, compassion, wanting to try to communicate that wisdom and insight to people who are suffering, motivates one, is embodied in the doctrine of upaya. Even compassion itself. Here's a famous passage from the Vimalakirti Sutra, the one I pointed out, the Mahayana text. Perfection of wisdom, prajna, insight, is the Bodhisattva's mother, and skillful means upaya, the father. Of all the teachers of sentient beings, none are not born from these. Note that. Of all the teachers of not all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, of all the teachers of sentient beings, none is not born of that. The claim here is that all teachers embody this notion of upaya. They take into consideration the capacity, the context of their audience, and they teach accordingly. So it's not as if there's some absolute teaching that has to be communicated. We find many examples of this, and here I'm going to cite a number of passages, and in particular from the Lotus Sutra, which is famous for articulating this doctrine of upaya, that exemplify what this sort of upaya represents within the tradition. To give you one of the most famous is a parable in the Lotus Sutra called the Parable of the Burning House. And I'll just read a kind of brief sort of summary of this. One day a fire broke out in the house of a wealthy man who had many children. The wealthy man shouted at his children inside the burning house to flee. But the children were absorbed in their games and did not heed his warning, though the house was being consumed by flames. When the wealthy man devised a practical way to lure the children from, then the wealthy man devised a practical way to lure the children from the burning house. Knowing that the children were fond of interesting playthings, he called out to them, "Listen, outside the gate are the carts that you have always wanted. Carts pulled by goats, carts pulled by deer, carts pulled by oxen. Why don't you come out and play with them?" The wealthy man knew these things would be irresistible to his children. The children, eager to play with these new toys, rushed out of the house, but instead of the carts that he had promised, the father gave them a cart much better than any he has described. A cart draped with precious stones and pulled by white bullocks. The important thing being that the children were saved from the dangers of the house on fire, even though the father ostensibly lied to them. In this parable, the father, of course, is the Buddha, and sentient beings are the children trapped in the burning house. The burning house represents the world burning with fires of old age, sickness, and death. The teachings of the Buddha are like the father getting the boys to leave their pleasures for a greater pleasure of nirvana. The message here is that the Buddha devises certain teachings in order to attract people to progress along the path, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily ultimate in nature. Another example, what the Buddhas preach, according to the Lotus Sutra, accords with what is appropriate, but the end point of its meaning is hard to understand. Shariputra, one of the right-hand disciples of the Buddha, and this is the historical Buddha ostensibly talking here. Shariputra, since achieving Buddhahood, I have, by a variety of means and by resort to a variety of parables, broadly set forth the spoken doctrine. By countless devices, leading living beings and enabling them to abandon their encumbrances. Another example. For these reasons, he says, the ignorance and attachment of beings, Shariputra, for their sakes I established an expedient device, that's upaya, preaching ways that put an end to woe and showing them nirvana. Though I preach nirvana, listen to this, there is no true extinction. The dharmas from their very origin are themselves eternally characterized by the marks of quiet extinction. Though I preach nirvana, there is no true extinction. So in the Lotus Sutra, there's actually another parable about a city like the city of Oz that people are attracted to. It's like the golden city on the hill. And they get there and there's no city. And the analogy is that's what nirvana is. That the Buddha, the historical Buddha, taught that the end route, the end goal was nirvana. But in actuality, it was just upaya. It was a skillful means. It was a way to get people motivated on the path. But when they get there, they realize they come to see there really is no nirvana. And what they are truly searching for is Buddhahood itself, according to the Mahayana tradition. And finally, one more passage. Because living beings have different natures, different desires, different actions, and different ways of thinking and making distinctions. Think about that. Different ways of thinking and making distinctions. That's like, in our terms, different worldviews, different ways of categorizing and understanding reality. And because I, the Buddha, want to enable them to put down good roots, I'm motivated by compassion, I employ a variety of causes and conditions, similes, parables, and phrases, and preach different doctrines. So because people have different dispositions, because one might say there are different places on the spiritual path, the teachings are different. This is the monk I study from the 13th century. And I only show this to show how this notion of upaya sort of permeates through all of Mahayana Buddhism, even up to the 13th century in Japan. And he writes sort of a similar kind of idea. Numerous gates to the Dharma await and open according to one's capacity. And we receive the sweet medicine of the Dharma according to our karmic predisposition. They are all part of the true Dharma, realized by the great teacher Shakyamuni through difficult and arduous practices over innumerable kalpas. Now, to be attached to one teaching or one object of devotion is to utterly obstruct the path to liberation. Jokei lived at a time when there were certain Buddhist leaders who said there really is only one practice that is sort of efficacious now. There's only one object to devote oneself. So there was a kind of an exclusivity that emerged during his lifetime that he was fighting against and using, in a sense, this whole rationale for upaya. Finally, Edward Konza, a famous Buddhologist, summarizes skill and means, or upaya, this way. Skill and means is the ability to bring out the spiritual potentialities of different people by statements or actions which are adjusted to their needs and adapted to their capacity for comprehension. Now, analytically, there are a number of different ways that we, as students of Buddhism or observers of Buddhism, might interpret upaya. For example, we could see it as a pedagogical strategy for teaching, that is born out of compassion, of understanding that your audience is not always the same and that you have to adapt your message accordingly. So you could see it as a pedagogical strategy. You can also see that there are some philosophical underpinnings to this, which I haven't really gone into, but is related to some of the philosophical developments that take place within Mahayana Buddhism. And that is that language is always contingent on context. That one has to speak in a language and sort of adapt themselves to a particular language and cultural context, you might say, in order to communicate your ideas. If, I don't know, what's an example? If Jesus Christ had stood up and started talking about karma and nirvana and samsara in the context of Jewish Middle East, nobody would have understood what he was talking about, right? So it's not to say that it's equivalent, but I'm saying that in order to sort of teach, language, teachings, ideas are always tied to a very specific cultural or contingent and dependent on the context. And so this sort of relates to why one, as a teacher, have to kind of understand that context and one's audience and their capacity in order to communicate your message. Hermeneutical function, I've sort of written about this. There are 6 different ways one might, and I'm not going to enumerate all of them, but here I mean that one could see upaya as kind of a doctrine that tries, after there's a great deal of diversity within the tradition, to make sense of that diversity. That is to say, it's a doctrine that sort of validates or legitimizes the pluralism that had developed within Mahayana Buddhism. We don't know how this happened, but that is how it's sometimes used in Buddhist texts, particularly philosophical texts. So that's another kind of way that we can see upaya being used. And finally, I should note that there can be a downside to upaya, and you might be able to guess it, but that is that it is susceptible to sectarianism to some extent. This takes place in China, and I won't go into this in detail, but China imports Mahayana Buddhism, the early tradition, all of these texts, and the Chinese initially just cannot make sense of this, what all of these texts that claim to be the teachings of the historical Buddha that seem to contradict. And one of the ways the Chinese made sense of this was to create a kind of hierarchy of teachings, or a classification of teachings, so that at one time in the Buddha's career he taught this message, at another time he taught this message, at another time he taught this message. And if we're talking about the Tiantai school in China, of course, they adhered to the Lotus Sutra, so the Lotus Sutra was the highest teaching. That was the superior teaching. And so sometimes you see in the rhetoric of various schools of Buddhism the notion that ours is really the ultimate, the superior teaching, and all of those other teachings are upaya. It's kind of like a condescending, well, that's for those ignorant people down there, but here we're the superior ones. So sometimes it's appropriated in that kind of sectarian, condescending, pejorative sense. What emerges, according to one scholar, in general, and I think this is sort of a fair characterization, is that Mahayana does not seek an exclusive differentiation of teachings, some to be confirmed and some to be rejected, but rather implies an inclusive universalism. That is to say that all teachings are sort of aspects of the universal teaching and appropriate for people in different places and different times. So it's a kind of an inclusive, so in response, just within Buddhism itself, in response to the plurality of teachings and practices and so forth that developed over the centuries, Mahayana embraces all of them. So it's generally very inclusive in its teachings. Now, why do I bring this up? One might ask, okay, how does upaya play out when Buddhism encounters other religious traditions? As it does when it spreads from India to China to Korea to Japan and other places. Generally speaking, Buddhism has been extraordinarily tolerant when it moves into kind of a new place. It tends not to claim exclusive, sort of claims of truth or anything like that. And very often it tends to adapt itself to the cultural context that it moves into. In fact, in many cases, it tends to kind of assimilate. It appropriates ideas, practices, teachings, even gods and deities that pre-exist in various places, and appropriate them into its own sort of cosmological system. To give you an example here, when Buddhism moves into Japan, there is what we think of today as Shinto, which is the worship of kami, sort of an animist kind of belief that Mount Fuji and certain auspicious forms in nature are embodied by this kind of sacred divine source. And so there were a number of kami who were kind of famous and well known. Some that were nature and some that were sort of personified, like Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, who's supposed to be the founder of Japan. Well, over time, as Buddhism made its way in Japan, it sort of claimed that these kami were actually manifestations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who adapted themselves in their manifestation appropriate to the land of Japan. And so even there ended up being sort of correspondences between Amaterasu is the equivalent of Shakyamuni, and this god is equivalent to this Bodhisattva, and this goddess is equivalent to this Buddha, and that sort of thing. So the Buddhists kind of appropriated Shinto into its system of belief. It didn't negate those deities, but it sort of claimed them for itself. And you can interpret that in other ways. How about contemporary voices? That is to say, if we were to look at and see what contemporary Buddhists say about in terms of the encounter with other religions. For those of you who may be familiar, Thich Nhat Hanh and the Dalai Lama are probably the two most famous Buddhists in the West. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Vietnamese monk who currently lives in France, is an exile from Vietnam, but he has traveled extensively throughout the states in the West in general. And he really emphasizes the importance of dialogue between religious traditions, but not in trying to convert the other followers of the other tradition, but in a sense to share sort of insights into the nature of reality. To give you an example, real dialogue makes us more open-minded, tolerant, and understanding. Buddhists and Christians both like to share their wisdom and experience. Sharing in this way is important and should be encouraged, but sharing does not mean wanting others to abandon their spiritual roots and embrace your faith. That would be cruel. People are stable and happy only when they are firmly rooted in their own tradition and culture. To uproot them would make them suffer. There are already enough people uprooted from their tradition today, and they suffer greatly, wandering around like hungry ghosts looking for something to fulfill their spiritual needs. We must help them return to their tradition. Each tradition must establish a dialogue with its own people first, especially with those young people who are lost and alienated. During the last 15 years, while sharing the Buddha's Dharma in the West, I always urged my Western friends to go back to their own traditions and rediscover the values that are there, those values they have not been able to touch before. And one other brief quote from Thich Nhat Hanh: "No single tradition monopolizes the truth. We must glean the best values of all traditions and work together to remove the tensions between traditions in order to give peace a chance. For the future to be possible, I urge you to study and practice the best values of your own religious tradition, to share them with young people in ways that they can understand." So when Thich Nhat Hanh, who has actually been very, very engaged in both Jewish and Christian Buddhist dialogue, he's sort of wrote a book called Living Buddha, Living Christ, in which he almost sounds like a Christian half the time that he's writing the book. The Dalai Lama, in a similar way, sort of articulates, I think, almost explicitly the doctrine of upaya. Let me read just a few passages. In encounters with a Benedictine monk in Spain, and with Thomas Merton, I might add, he writes, "I developed a genuine reverence for the Christian tradition and its capacity to create people of such goodness. I believe the purpose of all the major religious traditions is not to construct big temples on the outside, but to create temples of goodness and compassion inside, in our hearts. Every major religion has the potential to do this." Note, Dalai Lama has a very sort of pragmatic, almost utilitarian understanding of religion. Religion is a means by which people are transformed from self-centered, egotistical, selfish people to altruistic, compassionate beings. And he sort of argues every religion has the capacity to transform people in that way. Some believe that the best way to attain harmony among religions is to create one universal religion. Here is an articulation of upaya. However, I have always felt that we should have different religious traditions because human beings possess so many different mental dispositions. One religion simply cannot satisfy the needs of such a variety of people. And finally, as mentioned earlier, it is my full conviction that the variety of religious traditions all today is valuable and relevant. According to my own experience, all of the world's religious traditions provide a common language and message upon which we can build genuine understanding. In general, I'm in favor of people continuing to follow the religion of their own culture and inheritance, Of course, individuals have every right to change if they find that a new religion is more effective or suitable for their spiritual needs. But generally speaking, it is better to experience the value of one's own religious tradition. So here, Dalai Lama is sort of speaking in very pragmatic terms, something sort of fundamental to the Buddhist tradition, that religion is a means, not an end, that the teachings are a means, not an end. But he's also saying that it's appropriate to have a variety of different religious traditions because people have different dispositions, which is, again, kind of an articulation of this doctrine of Upaya. Now, I wonder if this sounds like a kind of monotheistic version of Upaya. Arnold Toynbee was a British historian who died in 1975, and he once wrote, "If God loves mankind, it would also seem unlikely that he would not have made other revelations to other people beside ourselves as well. And it would seem unlikely that he would not have given his revelation in different forms, with different facets, and to different degrees, according to the difference in the nature of the individual souls and the nature of the local tradition of civilization." So does it not make sense that God would operate out of the mindset of Upaya, adapting God's revelation to specific context and people's sort of capacity to understand? I don't know how receptive Toynbee's idea was. So the implications for Upaya in terms of our contemporary challenge of religious pluralism is that perhaps various teachings exemplify Upaya, various religious traditions, one might interpret them as sort of exemplifying the idea of Upaya, that some teachings may be appropriate for a particular context, time, and cultural origin, and that it may be appropriate for a particular spiritual bent or tendency or need. I'm going to just stop there for a second. It's 10 minutes, and I want to give you a chance to sort of ask some questions. So I haven't really come to any great conclusion here, but it has always struck me in studying Buddhism and how this doctrine of Upaya has operated, in particular within the Mahayana tradition, that this is a fairly useful tool for the Buddhist tradition. And it has become a useful tool not just in making sense of the diversity within Mahayana Buddhism itself, but as Buddhism encountered other religious traditions, they sort of appropriated the same idea. They understood these teachings. The Dalai Lama even has spoken of Jesus Christ as perhaps, I think in one passage he sort of says, Jesus probably had other previous lives, and so he sort of equated him with a Bodhisattva who appeared in a certain place and then adapted his teachings to that context. You may find that offensive, but that's how, from a Buddhist perspective, they might make sense of this kind of diversity in different revelations and different teachings and that sort of thing. Questions or comments? Yeah?
This is what you said. You said that Christ adopted the teachings as a Bodhisattva for the current culture. But, is that accurate? Wasn't it really countercultural? What the Jewish tradition was doing, he was kind of opposite of all Sabbath things and things
Well,
like that.
I guess what the Dalai Lama is saying, he's appropriating the kind of worldview that existed at that time.
Yeah.
He's transforming it. He's radically challenging it in certain ways, and that's what a bodhisattva would do as well. But he's not, entering and talking about karma, nirvana, samsara, right? He's not talking in those terms, but now that's just the Dalai Lama speculating, but that's a Buddhist making sense of a figure like Jesus Christ, who he admires greatly. In terms of the teachings. But
some writers claim that Buddhism is really not a religion, that it is a philosophy, that it teaches you to be tolerant and compassionate, and through practices of that nature, you will learn not to suffer and also serve others. So, is this a contemporary thought, or is it something that is embedded in the tradition? Is it something that the new Western writers are using to sell perhaps a something that doesn't carry the baggage as the word religion to people, or is it really a philosophy?
It's a question that only arises when the West encounters the East.
Yeah.
For example, when Western colonialists go to China and, they ask, what is your religion? And they look at you like, what are you talking about? Because in those contexts, in those cultures, there was no word for religion. There was no word for religion in the Japanese language. They didn't understand religion as being a separate sphere of culture and life. Now they have understood what's being asked, and so they label things as religion. But I think it depends on the definition of religion that you use. But if you use a definition of religion that is, worship of some transcendent reality, and with notions of salvation, it's difficult not to classify Buddhism as religion, as it's practiced by 99% of Buddhists. Because there are a whole cosmology of supernatural beings, and there is kind of an ultimate goal of salvation that is transcendent in some way. All of those and there are lots of rituals and practices, all of those are characteristics of religion, by most definitions.
But Buddhism really teaches you that you shouldn't hold on to anything anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So by holding on to the beliefs of Buddhism, you're going in the wrong direction. You may want to practice them, but holding on tightly to anything in this impermanent life,
Right.
you're not going to go the right way.
Right. And that's embodied in what we were talking about too. She was sort of saying that Buddhism teaches non-attachment to all sort of teachings and beliefs. In other words, you've seen that so far, that this notion to understand that even the teachings of the Buddha about nirvana, the Four Noble Truths, all of those are fundamentally sort of not ultimate in terms of ultimate truth. They are provisional teachings. And so they're just like the raft. Once you cross the river, there's no point in clinging to that teaching as though you've captured eternal truth in some way. Because according to Buddhism, eternal truth can't be put into words or language or concepts. So just understand all teachings as provisional in its nature as kind. So don't become attached.
So Buddhism is actually pragmatic in the sense that you either practice it or you don't.
Yeah.
You're a good Buddhist if you practice
Right.
the idea.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so subscribing to a certain dogma or doctrine or belief is not characteristic of Buddhism.
Is there an interest in translating the concepts into political organization?
What concepts do you mean?
Well, just the entire body of thought. Does this move over into government, into law, into social organization, into society? Or does it remain a private ethic, religion?
That's a really good question. One thing from the beginning, Buddhism, monastics are prohibited from entering into the political realm. The Dalai Lama is kind of a unique figure he's a unique figure, being both a political and a religious leader is unique to Buddhism, and the exception. But generally, Buddhists did not engage or take on political positions. That's not to say that they weren't engaged with political authorities, because they were dependent on patronage and support and all of that kind of thing. So that's one answer. So Buddhism never became, something like the Catholic Church in taking over the kind of political structure. But I would say that there are sort of ideal Buddhist kings of countries that were Buddhist, who embodied in their laws certain Buddhist tenets. Ashoka is probably the most famous, 3rd century Indian ruler, one of the first pan-Indian ruler, who adopted many Buddhist ideas in his teachings. His palace was vegetarian, they didn't hunt and kill animals, he treated people who were poor, provided da-da-da-da. So there is a kind of an ideal in Buddhism for leaders of authority to adopt the sort of principles and virtues that Buddhism teaches. So I guess it permeates in that way.
What piqued your interest in studying research in Buddhism, Jay? Early on?
I'm sorry?
What piqued your interest, sparked your interest in studying
What piqued my
Buddhism?
interest? Well, some of you have been in my class before probably heard this, but I graduated as a math major from Chapel Hill, and I was in banking in New York for a while, and then I was in business anyway for about 8 years, but at some point, when I was about 30, I sold everything, quit my job, and I spent a little over a year traveling around the world. Don't ask me why. I was just kind of thought this would be the last chance to do that. And I spent most of that time in Asia, and I just became fascinated with Asian culture, Asian history, philosophy, religion. So when I came back, I just decided I would go to graduate school and see what it'd be like to go back to school, and kept going. But, it was that encounter, and it was, you know, experiencing these cultures that, you know, you're riding on a rickety old bus in Nepal, you know, with people beside you with chickens in their laps and things like that, and just think, you know, they're experiencing reality in a different way than I'm experiencing. The same thing is happening to them, but their experience is so different. It's kind of wanting to understand that very different worldview was something that just I was curious about.
Anyone else? Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.